for coming tonight. And
how many of you grew up without electricity? Not very many. I did. We didn't have electricity until 47. How many of you attended a one-room country school? Quite a few of you. How many of you heated your house with wood stoves? How many of you know what that little building back of the house was all about? That's my experience. And I was very surprised to know that there were a lot of other folks like that. The second show we did was Farm Winter. Never in my fondest dream did I think that anybody would be interested in learning more about winter. But lo and behold, that show aired now in every state, including Hawaii and all, and all across Canada. It was really something. And I'm supposed to be a writer, not a TV guy. That show won a regional Emmy Award. I mean, really, what's going on? It says something about stories and passing on information from one generation to the next. I got an email from a guy, a rancher in Nebraska, and he said, a friend of mine just down the way, a retired rancher, I go to see him often, and whenever I go there, he sits me down and I have to watch your TV show. He says, everybody that comes to his ranch first has to see your TV show. I think he's pulling my leg a little bit, but it's very humbling when I learn about that. Another thing that I've been doing now for a very long time, since 1971, I teach creative writing. Some of you know that. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, and it's my little Johnny Appleseed idea, is that I am trying to encourage as many people as possible to write down their stories, so that we don't lose a couple of generations, maybe 3 generations of stories of what it was like when you were a kid, and what it was like when you went to the one-room country school, and what it was like when it's 20 below zero and you had to make the trip out to that little building behind the big building. Writing that stuff down is so important. So I wrote this little book, Telling Your Story, based on the students that have been in my writing classes. I've had over 1,000 students now in my writing classes who are learning how to tell their own story. And if you're not into writing, and not everybody is, record it. Sit down with especially with a grandchild, because that skipping a generation really works well. And have them ask you some questions. What it was like at the 4th of July, what it was like at Christmas, what it was like when it was 90 degrees, what it was like working in the garden, all of that sort of thing. That's the stuff of the stories that I'm trying to get people to get down and save. And if some of you are, any of you are inclined, I teach at the Clearing in Door County. I've been there, 28 years now, and I teach a course called Telling Your Story. And this year's class is the 18th of August, and there are some brochures in the back if you'd like to pick one up that says more about that. So enough in the way of introductions. Steve Apps is my son, the photographer. Steve is the chief photographer for the Wisconsin State Journal. Steve is also the backer photographer for the State Journal, and has been for a number of years. And I twisted his arm and said, Steve, would you spend in your off time, would you run around the state with me for a couple of years and take pictures of barns? And he kind of rolled his eyes. And finally I said, well, how would you compare taking pictures of barns to taking pictures of Brett Favre? He won a big award for Brett Favre's picture. He said, he said, it's pretty easy. A barn never tries to run over you. Yeah. Steve's a big kid. He's, 6'3" or 4" and weighs a couple 100 pounds. A lot of people don't run over him, but anyway, he's the photographer. Now, if we could go to the first picture. One of the wonderful things that we can learn from our old barns, and Wisconsin has a variety of barns that exceed almost any other state in the nation. And I've traveled all over, especially in New England, in New York and Pennsylvania, looking at their barns. We have, that's great, we have some of the most diversity you could imagine. And one of the things we can learn from the old barns is how ethnically diverse we are. meaning how many Germans we have, and how many Norwegians, how many Poles, and all the rest. By looking at the old barns and digging into their history, because every old barn has a story to tell. Those of you who worked with this historical society and our members know that every building has a story to tell, especially does every barn have a story to tell. This is a Swedish log barn on Madeline Island off of Bayfield. The most unlikely place in the world where you would find a barn. If you were to turn around, it's on the shores of Lake Superior. It's just most interesting. Let's go to the next one. This is Norwegian. It's at Old World, Wisconsin. How many of you have been at Old World, Wisconsin? Quite a few of you. That's one of the best places to look at old ethnic buildings. This is a Norwegian log barn. And to the next one. Most people don't realize that we still do have, a sizable population of Finnish people in the far north of Wisconsin. And they had come to the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as miners. And when the mines played out, they moved to the west. On their way, many of them, to the Mesabi Range in Minnesota. But a lot of them stopped in Wisconsin and they took up farming. And any Finns in this group with that heritage? Meticulous, very meticulous people. The Finnish log barn is the most carefully constructed log barn of any of the ethnic groups. In fact, the logs are so carefully hewn that they use no nogging. That's the material you put between the logs. They hew them down so that you can't pull a piece of paper between the logs. It must have taken them forever to put together those Finnish barns. This one is also at Old World, Wisconsin. It previously was in Douglas County, way up north. Next one, please. The Germans, and by the way, I think most of you know this, when you think about the ranking of the numbers of ethnic groups in Wisconsin, number 1 is German, number 2 is Norwegian. There's some bunch of Norwegians in this group I was in. And number 3 is Irish. It was before 1900. After 1900, the Poles outnumbered the Irish, so the Irish became number 4. But that's the ranking of the ethnic groups. The Germans did something very interesting in building their barns, in that the structure of the barn, the timbers are on the outside rather than on the inside. And it's called half-timbering construction, and it's just very interesting. So let's go to the next one. Well, not only can we learn about the ethnic roots of our state through our barns, but we can learn a lot about our agricultural history. And prior to when many of these ethnic groups arrived here, the Germans and the Swedes and all the rest of them, a sizable number of people came to this state from New England, and especially upstate New York. I think most of you know that, especially down in Waupaca County, where I grew up. The township where I have my farm now, the township of Rose, next to Wild Rose, comes from upstate New York. There's a Rose, New York. In fact, I stopped to visit there one time when I was doing research at Syracuse University. Went up to Rose, New York, and went into this little post office. Rose is a little tiny place, a lot smaller than Wild Rose. I went to this post office and I said to the woman that I'm from Wild Rose, Wisconsin. And it was like a long lost son had returned. And we looked at the places where they delivered mail, and half of those names are the names around Wild Rose, which means that was a really strong connection. So a lot of New England people came to Wisconsin, not only to Waupaca County, but all over the southern part of the state. So, and they came here. Many of them had been dairy farmers in New York. New York was the premier dairy state in the nation at Civil War time, before the Civil War, 1840s and 50s. And they came here not to milk cows, but to grow grain, especially wheat. And so in this picture you see a couple of guys going out to harvest wheat. It was all done by hand. The fellow on the right has a cradle, the other guy has a rake. The grain was harvested with that cradle, raked and tied into bundles, all done by hand. The grain was sowed by hand, it was cut by hand, it was threshed by hand, or sometimes an oxen walked around on it on the barn floor. If we could go to the next one, please. We saw the emergence of the first barns in Wisconsin at that time. And they are 3-bay threshing barns, they were called. They were designed not to house cattle or horses or any kind of livestock, but they were there to store wheat. In 1862, when we were in the midst of the Civil War, Wisconsin was the second most prominent wheat-growing state in the nation. Illinois was first. And the wheat was stored on either end. Those of you that know something about barn language, you're divided into bays, these old barns. Each bay has a separate section. And 3 bays mean there's a section on the left, section on the right, section in the middle. And the middle was the threshing floor, that middle bay. And the threshing floor is when the flail was used to thresh the wheat, or that's where the old oxen walked around on it to thresh the wheat. There were 2 doors. You can see one here, there's a door just like that on the other side. Those 2 doors opened, a breeze would blow through and blow off the shaft. And underneath each of these doors was a plank, maybe a 2x6, 2x8, something like that. And it was called the threshold, because it held in the grain. And when you go home tonight and you open the door to your home and you step across the threshold, you'll now know where that language comes from. It comes from the days of the 3-bay threshing barn when we were threshing grain by hand. Sowed by hand, harvested by hand, threshed by hand. Next slide. Well, everything was going wondrously well. I mean, we had farmers making tons of money off of wheat. What they did not know in those days, they didn't know anything about fertilization. They didn't know anything about crop rotation, meaning that you don't plant the same crop on the same field year after year. They had done this in New York. And that's why they moved west, because they, to use the language of the old farmers, they wore out the land. And so now they have worn out Wisconsin's land. Green Bay to La Crosse and south, I'm talking about. The north was the great pinery, the great North Woods. I'm writing a book about that right now. Well, what happened now with wheat growing failing? What are we going to do? Some of these farmers, they really liked growing wheat. I mean, my gosh, you had all winter off. You could sit around and smoke your pipe and do whatever, play cards. And so some of them moved on west to Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, and continued to grow wheat.
Sorry.
Some of them stayed. They liked it here, but geez, they couldn't make a living anymore. This is a tobacco barn over in the southwestern part of the state, Vernon County, Westby, Viroqua. My wife Ruth's from Westby. I was introduced to tobacco growing. My father-in-law grew tobacco. It's the worst job in the world. You think picking cucumbers is miserable, try working in tobacco. How many of you pick cucumbers? That's my background. So this was tobacco barn. Southern Wisconsin too, Edgerton and down that way, Janesville, that was all tobacco country. And there was good money in tobacco, but they couldn't grow it everywhere. And it didn't quite have the same amount of income potential as wheat growing did. Let's go to the next one. In this part of the country, in central Wisconsin, Waupaca County, and a lot of Waupaca County and Portage County, we started growing potatoes. And this is a little old-time potato cellar. Some of you have seen one just like that. We had one just like this on our farm, where the potatoes were stored in the bottom part of the building and the machinery was stored in the top. And I must say, how many of you pick potatoes? I mean, not just in the garden, but seriously picked them. Well, even when in the 30s, when I was a kid, we still grew 20 acres of potatoes. Now that doesn't sound like much when you talk to some of the folks over by Plover and they got 2,000 acres. But 20 acres of potatoes planted by hand, hoed by hand, and we hoed forever in the potato patch, and then picked by hand. That was my experience. In fact, my country school, a couple of miles west of Wild Rose, the building is still standing, we had a potato vacation in October. 2 weeks for all the kids picked potatoes. And my dad, bless him, he paid me a penny a bushel for picking potatoes. And if you really hustled, and potatoes were good, you had two good diggers, I could pick 100 bushels a day and earn $1. And I saved all those dollars and bought my first .22 rifle. That was from my potato picking. Well, in that bottom of that potato barn, if you want to call it that, we kept a fire going always in the winter because you couldn't. The prices were so terrible in October that we waited until March, or a warm day in March, and then we would sort the potatoes, put them. And I remember as a kid doing this. And we would put them in bags that weighed 150 pounds each. We were the dumbest people in the world. And I look back at why would we want 150 pounds of potatoes? So we could brag to somebody that two people could lift it, I suppose, something like that. Anyway, and then we would haul the potatoes. Wild Rose in those days, and I don't know about Waupaca, but Wild Rose had a lineup of potato warehouses along the railroad tracks. And we would haul the potatoes there and sell them to one of the warehouse people. And they would load them on boxcars. And I was giving a talk to a group of seniors a few years ago. And this old guy said that I was one of the kids, young guys, he was 15, 16. I rode the train with potatoes from Wisconsin to St. Louis. And each kid had responsibility for 2 boxcars. And there was a wood stove in each one to keep the potatoes from freezing. And the job of the kid was to keep the stoves going. I just thought that was interesting. And then he said, when we rolled into Milwaukee or into Chicago, we would hustle to find coal that the steam engines had lost, and we would gather that up and we'd put that in these stoves, and then we could sleep a lot more because the coal would hold the heat. Let's go to the next one. It took a while before the University of Wisconsin caught on to the idea that maybe dairy farming would be something that these farmers could do. And the New Yorkers, William Dempster Horde, Hiram Smith, they started talking to their neighbors. And they started saying, look, you fellas, neighbors, you can make money with cows. We did it in New York. We don't want to mess with those stinking cows. That's something that women should take. That's their job. They don't mess with cows. In 1897, the University of Wisconsin-Madison built that beautiful barn. And they sent a group of engineers to France, to Normandy, to come up with a design for a barn that would be a model for Wisconsin dairy farmers. Have you seen a barn like this anywhere? I don't think so. It's just that it's still standing. We've saved it. So a bunch of us got together. I wanted to tear it down, put up some biotech building, and a bunch of us got together and said we better save that. A lot of history there. See that ramp in the back? You could drive a team of horses up in the back. And there was no such thing as a silo filler in those days, or a blower. So there was a cutter, a silage cutter up on the second floor, and then they dumped the silage into the top, over the top of that silo. I have a whole chapter in my book on the history of silos. I'm not going to go into that very much tonight, but it's absolutely a fascinating history. Because we did not, as a group of farmers at that time, want to accept silage as a feed for cattle. In fact, the Farm Journal, in one of its editorials said, do not feed silage to your cattle. All their teeth will fall out, and besides that, no cheese factory will buy milk where the cattle eat silage. How wrong that guy was at the Farm Journal. That's one of the first cylindrical silos. The early ones were square. The very first ones were underground. And F.H. King, an engineer, ag engineer at Madison, he was responsible for coming up with a cylindrical silo. The French, we got the idea for silage from the French. The French were the great fermenters. They still are. If they could make wine, they also made silage. And silage is a fermented product, interestingly enough. And to be too technical, maybe it's an anaerobic process, meaning there can't be any air, any oxygen. And with a square silo or an octagonal silo, there was always room for some air in the corner, and that would cause mold. So the round silo was a revolutionary thing, the cylindrical silo. Let's go on. Now, starting about 1870, we began slowly. People think it happened quickly. It did not. It took 30 years, 40 years, for Wisconsin to shift from growing wheat to milking cows. And the main reason was, and I hinted at it a moment ago, these wheat farmers saw taking care of cows women's work. It was a gender issue. And it took 30 years for them to wrap their minds around the fact that they, the men, could milk cows. And once they decided that it was something they would do, they really went after it, and they started building these wonderful barns, of which we had at one time some 200,000 in Wisconsin. We've lost so many of them. We're down to maybe 50,000 now. 200,000. This is a bank barn, one of the early styles of barns. It has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with a ramp that goes up to the second floor. Bank barn. Generally backed up to the side hill, but if your farm is flat, well, then you're going to have to do a ramp. The hay was stored in the upper part. The cattle were in the lower part. Let's go to the next one. If you want to sort of not get all that interested in barns, but just drive around and look at them, you can tell roughly when a barn was built by its roof style. And this is the oldest roof style, gable roof. You will see them going back, well, way back. But you saw that little 3-bay thrashing barn. That was a gable roof. First barns were then gable. And we did not start doing the gambrel, if you go to the next one, please, the gambrel roof until about the turn of the century, 1890s to 1910, 12, along in there is when we started building this gambrel roof. The gambrel roof allowed for more storage space in the upper part. It was a little more difficult to build, but we began seeing a lot of them. Let's go to the next one. And then we moved to another style by the Second World War. And that's because during the Second World War, we came up with, the military really came up with all kinds of lamination, glues, allowing wood to be bent. And so these beams in this barn were bent, and thus we came up with a Gothic style of barn. Over in southwestern Wisconsin and on into Iowa and southern Minnesota, we find a number of monitor-style barns, they're called, more likely for beef cattle than for dairy cattle. This one's just out of Dodgeville on 151. You can see it on the right-hand side. How many of you have been to a barn raising? Any of you? I had that privilege as a kid, and I had a chance to do it again 20 years ago. This is a barn raising. And it was one of the most interesting, fascinating things that happened on a farm. Because now we're putting together, and these beams and posts are called bents when they're all together. And so each bent was constructed on the ground during the summer. And then on a late summer day, all of the neighbors and friends were invited to come and help with the barn raising. And so you see this huge crew. There's a team of horses that you can't see that's helping to pull that bent up into place. One bent at a time. Huge barns went up that way. Fascinating process. Oh. Well, if OSHA saw this picture, because once the structure of the barn was together, People crawled all over the thing, the young guys, and to show off the fact that they had the structure together. There were generally two parts to it. Most barns had a fancy stone wall, depending on where you were in Wisconsin. Southwestern Wisconsin was not glaciated. So there you would see quarried rock as the barn walls. One of the interesting things driving around Wisconsin, if you drive blindfold you and dump me out, I can tell you roughly where you are based on the kind of wall there is in the old barns and churches and houses. Fieldstone was the popular style in this area in a lot of Wisconsin. Okay. Here's another fact that a lot of people miss. There was not an ounce of metal that went into the construction of these old barns in terms of the beams and the posts. They were put together with wooden pegs, which made for a wooden integrity. You all know, I'm sure, that with freezing and thawing, nails pop and metal and wood expands and contracts at different rates. Here we have a wooden integrity. And one of the most wonderful things that I remember as a kid is standing in our old barn on a windy day and listening to the barn talk to me. It's just like standing in the middle of an orchestra with all that sound all around you as the barn is talking based on the wind that is buffeting it. It's marvelous. These pegs, by the way, I should have brought one along. You can tell they're about that big around, about that long. They're not insignificant. Mind you now, all this was done without electricity. No electricity. Hand tools. Some of you have seen the drills that are used, great big drill to drill these holes. Big old mallets to pound the posts into place. And these barn walls that I mentioned before. I had a chance to interview an old stonemason. And I said to him, "You really are an artist, aren't you?" And he didn't want to be known as an artist. But look at the shapes and sizes and colors. He knew exactly what he was doing as he mixed and matched all these different old rocks. And these barn walls are 30 inches, sometimes 3 feet thick. I mean, that's what he wanted to be known as. He says, "My walls do not tip over." Well, they sure don't. Now, as you travel around the state, you'll often see a barn missing, but the wall is still there because these walls are really built well. Interestingly enough, and some of you likely know that the Sears Roebuck Company made houses. Did you know that? There are Sears houses all over the place. They also made barns. And I have one of the Sears barn catalogs. Many different styles of barns that you could order from the Sears catalog in Chicago. And they would load all the pieces on the train car and send them to Waupaca or Wild Rose or wherever you had to be. And you would go there with your team and your wagon, and all these pieces, you'd be in a big pile. And then, I can't imagine, a big old instruction book on how to put it together. And anyway, let's go to the next one. What Sears came up with, they had some wonderful engineers who were thinking way beyond post and beam, which is the old-time barns. They were thinking of having vast open areas, not crowded with posts as the old style was. And this is the inside of a Sears barn. Any of you see, is there a Sears barn in this area that anybody knows about? Whereabouts?
Well, it's the one I restored. It was but 2 barns put together. And I could tell by the arch, by the...
Yeah, the style was very...
And the price of the barn originally was, what was it, $400?
Something like that. Yeah. And they were, the pieces were all such that they could be, you could have a 40-foot barn or an 80-foot barn, it didn't matter. You just matter of you use pieces in a different way. Let's go to the next one. All kinds of materials were used in constructing the barns. By and large, it was wood, but there are a lot of exceptions. This happens to be an all-stone barn in Oconto County, and the local historical society is restoring it, and it's just a beautiful example of building a barn from the ground up Now, without any hydraulics, how can you imagine getting those rocks way to the top of that thing? That was a tricky deal. And this is an old horse barn, and well, it probably looks better than it does here even now. Various shapes of barns. Oh my gosh, most of them are rectangular, but it's octagonal, 8-sided. This you will find at Old World, Wisconsin. It's a restaurant now. Originally it was in Waupaca County. And the barn builder, and he built a bunch of them, Ernest Klausing was his name, German. And the Klausing barns, there are a couple of them still in Waupaca County, I think one's a church, where people say, why were they 8-sided? Well, one of the wags said that's because the winds coming off of Lake Michigan couldn't raise as much havoc with an octagonal barn. I don't think that was the correct answer, but it sounded kind of interesting. I think the octagonal barns were built because that's the kind that Ernest Klausing knew how to build. That's often the case in these things. There's a barn by Columbus. I think it has 19 sides, something like that. The guy wanted to build a round barn and quite didn't know how to get there. But round barns, one time I counted, did an inventory, I think we had 100, not so many, 150 round barns. There's a nice one here just on the way to on 54 out of Waupaca. Very nice round barn. But over in Vernon County, my wife's home county, there were the largest number of round barns in the United States in that county. And I'm not so sure that's true today. But the round barns had a really interesting history. There was an African-American barn builder by the name of L.J. Shivers, who had come to Vernon County prior to the Civil War. Well, maybe you don't know, we had 2 African-American farm communities in Wisconsin before the war. And L.J. Shivers built these round barns, one after the other. Beautiful. The reason we didn't have more of them and why they didn't continue is because most of the equipment does not like to go in a circle. It wants to go straight ahead, the mechanical equipment. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, they did some of the research, a lot of the research on round barns. And they were able to show that for the same amount of money that you put into the lumber and all the rest in constructing a rectangular barn, that money would build you a bigger barn that was round. There were some practical problems, as people pointed out to me. If the farmer was so inclined to spend a little too much time in the local tavern and would come home to feed his cattle, it's hard to know when to stop because the cattle are round and round. Well, and others said, well, one of the real advantages, if you are a religious person, a round barn, the devil can never get you in the corner. There are no corners. Let's go to the next one. And this is another example of an existing round barn in Vernon County. Generally, the silo is right in the middle, so you could feed out of it, as I suggested, in a circle. And the barn was built so it was all tied into the silo, which is kind of interesting. Having the silo inside the barn had its advantages too, because one of the real problems with silos is the silage froze up in the wintertime. Here, obviously, the silo inside wasn't big enough, so they built some extra ones. Go ahead. Well, the story of cupolas. My gosh. These old cupolas, 1906, this one, were in every way an artistic creation. And they are no more, no less than a ventilator. They sit on top of the barn roof to allow the heat from the hay and the cattle to escape through the roof. But the old barn builders decorated them. And this is an example. Some are far more decorative than this one. They're just wonderful when you see them. One of the things that I've discovered in talking about barns is I always run into 1 or 2 or more barn photographers, and they just love cupolas. Let's go to the next one. Well, what happened was the cupolas, we had to have them, and so the Jamesway Company started making metal ones, and that thing sitting on the ground, stands about this high. And I've seen people buy those for antiques. I don't know why you would want a thing like that in your living room, but anyway, there it is. And I think you probably are all well aware, a few years ago, I think it started in either Ohio or Iowa, one or the other, a barn quilt project, meaning that these quilt designs were placed on barns. They're all over the place now. Wherever you drive, you see barn quilts on the ends and sides of barns. And well, they're kind of pretty. Well, you see this kind of stuff. Schuster switchers in the barn. By the way, barns way back into the early 1900s were used as billboards very often, especially when the first cars came along in the, 1917, 20, along in there. And they would they would be big billboards on the side of the barns, and the popular ones were Bull Durham tobacco and beer, and it would Miller beer. And by the way, here's how it would go: the salesperson would come up to the farmer and he'd say, "You know, we'd like to paint the side of your barn, because geez, most barns need painting now and again." And the farmer said, "What's the catch?" "Well, I want to advertise Bull Durham's chewing tobacco." And then the kicker was, "We'll give you, Mr. Farmer, a year's supply of chewing tobacco." I mean, who could resist that? Same way with the beer guy. He would come by and say, "Now, you didn't get a year's supply of Miller. I don't know how much you got, but you got some beer." So that's an interesting part of the barn history, is the barns as billboards. When you look at a farmstead, and I've looked at a lot of them, and most of you have as well. How many of you grew up on a farm, by the way? A bunch of you. The farmstead in it is like a little village with all of the buildings around, and the barn is always the biggest building in the lot. It's what it is. And then the corn cribs and the granaries and the smokehouse and all the rest of it all fit together. The barn is where the money was made. The house is where the decisions were made. I remember so clearly that right after the war, World War II, my dad decided that the cattle shouldn't have to go outside to drink water all winter long. We had a tank heater. Some of you remember tank heaters. And so he decided to make water available in the barn. So we got a special pump that pumps the water up, pipe it, a tank in the upper part of the barn. We had running water in the barn 25 years before we had it in the house. And my dad, when people say, "Herman, why don't you have running water in the house?" And he says, "There's no money that comes out of the house." One of the interesting things as you travel around Wisconsin is to see how these buildings relate to each other and to the environment around them. This is over in my wife's country, over toward the Mississippi River. And one of the interesting things that I discovered a few years ago, the Department of Tourism did a survey as to why people were coming up into Wisconsin. And they expected to hear that it was Wisconsin dells and the water slides and all that stuff. That would be number one. It was not. The number one reason that people were, in this survey, were coming into Wisconsin was to see the farmsteads, the cattle grazing on green grass, the red barns, and all the rest of it. I found that just fascinating. We take that so for granted. The beauty of our farmsteads in this state. We assume it's like that everywhere. It is not. It is not. Red barns, blue skies, green grass in the summer. And what's more beautiful in winter than a red barn and white snow? I mean, it's absolutely stunning. And we take it so much for granted. One more. Well, what's going on today? I've got a chapter in my book about restoration of old barns. We started a barn restoration project, I think 25 years ago or so now, right here in Waupaca. Is where we had our very first meeting. And there were several of us, the State Historical Society, the bunch of us who were interested in barns. Anyway, we thought maybe 25, 30 people would come. Well, 150 people or so came. And we then, for a number of years, continued barn restoration workshops, helping people who wanted to know something about their old barn and then how to repair it if it needed repair. And one of the things that I firmly believe is the more that we know about something, the more we're likely to take care of it. I was talking to a group in Platteville a couple of years ago, and I was waxing eloquent, I suspect, I hope, on corn cribs, the old corn cribs that you remember. And this farmer came up to me afterwards, and he had a big smirk on his face, and he said, guess what, Epps? You just saved a corn crib. You're going to tear his down. A lot of our barns are looking too much like that. They've just been forgotten. Or some housing development has gone over the top of them. Or, and let's go to the next one, they've just been forgotten. This is way up north. Beautiful old barn, trees growing up around it. It's been forgotten. And so I end with, as the moon rises on a cloudless night, our barn and silos stand alone, a piece of faded history, testament to early Wisconsin farmers who saw a future in dairy farming. Thank you all so very much.